go have to
Sounds good.
Screen, unfortunately. So just keep the little time here, and then switch to just speakers. And get them on there as best you can. And that's what you go with the and figure this one out.
Is the mic still an issue? I mean,
just make sure you're talking to the mic good.
Okay. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. I assume everyone can hear me just fine because I can definitely hear myself just fine, right? Okay. So this is Go With The Flow. It is how to get started with flow analysis really, really cheaply and, not have to worry about, vendors calling you telling it's going to be X amount of money. You'll just be able to set this stuff up in a few minutes. And, why not have it? Hopefully by the end of the day, I'll tell you why it's really important that you have it in a matter of 25 minutes. If I still get 25 minutes, I don't know. So my name is Jason Smith. I'm a pretty big car nut. Right now I live in Bowling Green. We drove up this morning. But I'm a big fan of big rural areas, despite, pretty soon we're moving to Nashville, but, I'm a big car nut. What you see there is a coffin on wheels pretty much made with a bunch of, scrap metal from the local metal shop. But, I'm a big fan of building different things. Built a previous dune buggy. It's now wrecked. And a big fan of, I say IoT enthusiast, but really it comes down to me being a fan of microcomputing. I use IoT because it's a buzzword and maybe you're like, oh yeah, IoT guy. But really I don't care about hair dryers that are on the internet and stuff like that. That doesn't make sense to me. Big fan of frying food. The idea that you can, toss something in, egg and flour and cook anything at, 350, 360 degrees, will completely, change everything. And I'm pretty sure almost anything that's, soft can be cooked that way and tastes pretty good. So here's the shameless spiel for Applied Network Security Monitoring. A buddy of mine, Chris Sanders, and I wrote this. Basically all the royalties go to charities, and that's why I constantly push this. I mean, the book came out a while ago, still kind of getting put in different prints all, across the world, but I push it because it's more of a thing about charities. So, Derbycon itself has always been pretty big with charitable contributions. All of our royalties go to things like Rural Technology Fund. They do a lot of putting in 3D printers and all kinds of tech labs in rural schools all across the nation. Hackers for Charity, Kiva, Hope for the Warriors, Autism Speaks, a lot of different charities. Highly recommend it. You buy it off Amazon, go to smile.amazon.com and do some more charitable contributions, all not out of your pocket. So what are we talking about today? Today we're talking about flow data. What is it? Why is it important? We're going to talk about some basics, but we're not going to go crazy about them. So I've given previous talks in other places that kind of go into more detail on the individual, what makes a flow, what starts it, what stops it, what's the times and all these other details, but they usually put people to sleep. So I won't talk about this today. Instead, we're going to talk more into how can I deploy flow solutions? How do I use the flow solutions I deploy? Are they free? Do they cost money? What should I do? What shouldn't I do? What are some pitfalls that people run into? Those kind of things. And maybe by the end of the day, it'll be kind of controversial if you currently deploy certain things. But hopefully not. Hopefully no fighting. So we'll talk about how do we collect it. It's really easy, and how to use this in situational awareness in your environment. Basically make friends with your NetOps group if you're not already NetOps, because a lot of times you have these people button heads, and next thing you know, you deploy something that's unsampled like this, and they're like, hey, you can run stats and do all these things for me, so we'll be your friends. So what is flow data? The best way to describe it is to compare it to PCAP data. In that it's like the complete opposite. So everyone knows what full PCAP is. It's, a big dump of everything that you have. It's the full recording. Comparable to phone traffic, it would be recording, a phone call, and put into, scale. I'm going to record every one of your phone calls, and then try to make sense of it. The challenging part being that you can't really make sense of every single second of every single phone call that I record here. So instead, you have, flow data. So the comparison is that, if you still have some sort of phone records that you receive from your provider, then it says, you called Joe or Jane, at a certain time, you talked for this long. Well, that's kind of what a flow record is, but for network data. The big use being that you can basically look at that, and if you had this recording of everyone, you could pivot off of those records and say, oh, well, I only need to look at this point in this traffic for these two people. So the perspective on flow data versus PCAP, like, well, why can't you go through PCAP and, kind of get whatever you need? Well, this is a big dump truck. This is a PCAP truck. It's about 793,000 pounds, a pretty heavy truck, but hauls a ton of data. We're going to compare this to, again, the coffin, and basically this Flowmobile. I compare it to a Caterham R500, which weighs about 1,000 pounds, and you compare that to that nearly 800,000 pound dump truck, and you have the flow comparison, but you have to stack 6 of those dump trucks together. Flows take up between 0.01% and 0.02% of the total amount of data that PCAP takes up. Now, obviously, that'll depend, if you've catered your PCAP to only be, some type of data versus, other types. I'm talking on average, your average network security monitoring deployment, you'll basically have around 0.01 to 0.02% of the difference. So flow data, what really, when we talk about it, what is it as a summary, right? It's a summary of all communications. It's not like the packets themselves. Like, you're not going to get a flow record for each packet. It's not like you're looking in, Wireshark and saying, oh, well, I see each packet here. Those are flows. Well, that's not the case. Flow record is a summary of the total communication. So it may say there were, 50 packets in this communication, and that's one record. That there were X amount of bytes in that communication. But in the end, it's basically just this 5-tuple plus some timing stuff. So a 5-tuple being your source port or source IP, source port, dest IP, dest port, and protocol. And then we throw on this little time stuff and some bytes. And depending on what type of flow data you're using, it has a lot of other stuff, up to like 120 some odd different fields. NetFlow version 5 does not have that many, but go to version 9 and IPFix and they do. Basically, we have everything but the what. So again, you have the who and where is it going, when did it happen. You won't really ever understand the why, maybe necessarily, even if you have correlation to PCAP. But hopefully you do come to that eventually. So how do we actually collect this stuff? Well, we generate flows based on some routers. In fact, a lot of your NetOps guys are like, oh, we already have flow data, man. We don't need any more. Hey, you don't need to be doing this on your sensor. We don't need to deploy anything. Well, a lot of times what you'll have is that sampled flow data. So it's like your quality engineer coming along and saying, oh, I want to take, 1 out of every 100, packets or 1 out of every 100 records that would have been made. And I'm going to give those to you. And you can run stats against those and it'll give you, overall quality of the network. Well, that doesn't really work out for security monitoring or incident response or anything like that. And really doesn't work out well for network operations. It's just a matter of less taxing processes on those routers and any kind of busy networking equipment that they already don't have the cycles to generate this data. Instead, you can say, oh, well, let's talk about sensors instead. So whereas routers normally are doing some sampled stuff and you're not in control of those things, we can build our own sensors. And if you already have a span port or some sort of mirror or tap or whatever that you're gathering data off of, running on IDS or something, you can just install fprobe or YAF on that and say, hey, look at this interface that I'm monitoring already, and it will generate all those flows on its own, and they'll be unsampled and they'll be great. Then your problem is, where do we send those? Because you can't do anything with just raw flows unless you have something to look at them in. Flows come in multiple types and flavors. Things like SFlow and JFlow and NetStream and CFlowD and AppFlow and RFlow and all kinds of flows, but we're going to talk about NetFlow and IPFix. Specifically, YAF is the tool we're going to talk about today, and it is IPFix. So popular platforms. So we talked about generating flows briefly. What can actually look at these things? Well, there are different solutions. You have raw NetFlow solutions, which only look at flows. They're built to look at, the 5-tuple and more. Then you have generic log aggregation solutions. A ton of people actually, use, Elk Stack to look at their flows. When you're looking at a lot of different things, I'll say that makes a lot of sense. But today I'm going to talk, a lot on the pros and cons of that. Silk and Argus, specifically, Argus is in Security Onion, and on a show of hands, who here has heard of Security Onion? Okay, a lot of people. It's an awesome crowd. Who uses Security Onion? Who uses it at work? Okay. Well, actually, yeah, that's pretty good. If Doug Burks is watching this, then everyone raised their hand. Just kidding. So a lot of people use NFDump. NFDump's pretty a classic, really, and they have NFSyn as well, which is a front end for NFDump to make it look prettier. Again, we talked about Security Onion. Argus is already built into Security Onion, and so we're going to talk about Silk today. And why Silk? That's a new guy to the crowd. Well, it's not really new, and it's also government backed. They kind of built it with Carnegie Mellon. It's pretty awesome. It can pretty easily handle 12 billion unidirectional flows per day. A lot of different networks they collect these flows, and they collect them indefinitely. Silk's pretty awesome. Both of them came around public use around 2003. So again, they're pretty rock solid. About the only thing Silk doesn't do well is ASNs. So why don't I recommend these generic log solutions? Well, we'll start with the pros of the log solutions on the right, top right. So they are really easily extendable. People using the Elk Stack already have their front end. The front end can be molded like clay, not quite Splunk clay, but pretty easily molded around. You can get graphs, you can get all kinds of stuff. It's actually quite fast if you have a proper setup and you have proper resources, which we'll talk about in a minute, what proper is and what it isn't. But, again, you can make different front ends for it. You can do a lot of stuff with Elasticsearch, great command line querying and stuff like that. And it's a centralized log source if you have a lot of disparate log data. So if you have a lot of these bro logs and you have all kinds of other logs coming in, then you might say, well, I don't want to go to different front ends. I just want to go to one front end and be able to query everything I want. And that's that. And, I can understand that because at some point it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have 10 different front ends out there. And you're saying, analyst one, this is how we do things here. And you give them 50 pages of documentation, if you have any documentation, and they're just kind of glaze over and they're like, I'm never going to be good at this. Because that's a big problem with the defensive side of things, I think, in security, and probably offensive as well. But where you have, new people coming in and they're like, I don't really know how to use things. We're going to talk about ways to have flow solutions on their own that will let you have a very, very easy learning curve. New analysts will be like, oh, this is great. This is easy. It's cake to use. And it will try to bridge the gap between some of the easier log solutions so that maybe it makes sense that even if you do have all this data coming in, it might still make sense to have this separate flow solution. So why would you have a separate flow solution? Well, storage-wise, and I'll give you some numbers here in just a minute, the storage is significantly better. Most of the places I've been in, they have indefinite flow storage. When they run out, they add more, because it's so easy to just keep, months, weeks, years. I worked at a couple of government places, federal government places and state, and they're all indefinite storage. I work now with FireEye. They do their own flow stuff. But in those government places, they had indefinite storage. The cons of flow data, flow-only solutions is that they are flows only. I mean, you're not going to be like, hey, let me put in my, bro HTTP logs into Silk, because that's not going to happen. Like, we just won't accept those. The big benefits of Silk, of flow solutions that are raw, they have their own formats usually. Like, for instance, Silk is this binary format. It's really, really quick to parse through even over long times. Usually they say limit it to like a week search, but when you're searching an entire week across an enterprise and you can say that that's reasonable to do, that's pretty impressive. Not all flow solutions are equal. I talk about Silk because I like Silk the most. Argus is pretty awesome. NFDump's pretty awesome. But we're going to talk about Silk. Again, it's based on kind of whatever you're used to. So I said storage issues were a con on the generic log solutions. Here's an example of just Elasticsearch versus Silk. Now, this is a little junky pie graph that shows a little red blip and a lot of blue. So what that red blip is an example of is 1/28th the time or of the data that Elasticsearch needs to use to actually store the same flow data. So this was all generated all at the same time from both solutions, both the same kind of way. They're both compressed results. It's about 4 million unique results. So these are 4 million unique flow records. And so Elasticsearch is using quite a bit. Now, there's newer Elasticsearch since then. I haven't tested that yet, but I'm not going to assume that it's going to be much better. So how do you actually get started with flows? Well, again, we're going to talk about Silk and this thing called FlowBat. So Silk, again, is the tool of my choice. It's the system for internet level knowledge made by Carnegie Mellon and those guys. Silk's pretty awesome. It's really easy to use once you know how to use it. It's not so easy to learn how to use it, though. They have some of the best documentation ever, which is pretty awesome. But again, it's like, the best documentation means that everything is documented, in depth. And the new guy who looks at that documentation, or even their analyst guide, it's huge. I mean, they can find anything they want. It just might take them, past the time in which they need to actually find it. So we made FlowBat. Chris Sanders and I made FlowBat to kind of take that learning curve and really, really knock it down. Granted, you're still going to have to know what you're looking for in like an English way. Can you ask yourself in a sentence, what am I looking for? Well, it's awesome. I'll show you, how that actually works here in a minute, because if you can ask that question, you can get the answer. It's really, really fast to install these. So we're looking at like 13 to 15 minutes, from the start until you have your flow solution set up, like completely. If you have like a really, really interesting network, it may be a little more challenging, but it's just 2 files to change if you have those. So it's not too hard. And overall, the big point of FlowBat is a time management thing. Allows you to pivot, allows you to interpret the field. So like, instead of someone being like, oh, what is protocol 6? Well, it'll tell you what everything is. It'll make guesses on what ports are and all kinds of things like that, including looking at payload to see, well, what is this actually? So again, Silk is just 2 different things. It's packing suite and analysis suite. A lot of people just deploy it out there. It'll gather flows, and then you can look at all the flows, use all these tools to filter and display and sort and do all kinds of stats and all kinds of fun things. But today we're not really going to talk about a lot of that. I'm going to show you maybe a couple examples of how Silk works, what it looks like, but that's probably one slide. So the Silk collection architecture. Basically, here we have 3 different ways of sending in data. You may have 2 sensors out there, and one of them may be ran by some other division of the like NetOps or something, and it may be running FPro. Well, it can accept that. It can accept even your sampled stuff, even though it's not really going to be useful. And it can accept any amount of sensors. It just needs to be configured to do so. And, say, hey, you're going to accept some IPFix stuff for NetFlow version 5. You'll tell it those things, and it'll interpret it, and then it'll throw it all in this flat format, which is why you can easily add additional storage. So again, it's like the comparison of some of these raw solutions. It isn't storing it in some sort of database of some kind, really. It's instead these binary files are just stacked up in timed directories. And basically the way that a query works is it says, oh, what time are you looking for? Well, I'm going to go to those directories, and then I'm going to look at the data within. The analyst would normally either SSH or use FlowBat to look at those flows that are then sent to that security server. So getting started with flows, kind of a summary. We will have routers or switches send stuff to it, or we'll have, in a better way, some unsampled data from YAF or FProbe or something like that, getting sent to the Silk box. The Silk server itself will have Silk installed, specifically because it needs RW FlowPack. But a lot of times, let's say FlowBat's on it, it's going to leverage those analysis tools as well. We'll put FlowBat on there as well, which is kind of just the front end again. It's not doing a lot of heavy lifting on its own. And then the analyst workstation will also exist, which may or may not have direct access. Maybe you're copying over all that Silk data because it's not actually a lot of data. Who knows what you're doing, but chances are it's going to be pretty easy for you to do it. I mean, a lot of people just rsync the data over or do anything like that. Again, I mentioned the sensors.conf, silk.conf at the bottom here. If you have some zany network, you may need to modify these and say, oh, well, these are my IP blocks here, these home nets essentially. I need to change those. So how do you install Silk? Well, you can go the hard way and do everything on your own, which is not actually too hard. I mean, again, their documentation is great. We also have this script which doesn't install anything that you don't want, trust me. But you can just run these commands and then you'll have fun. So basically just, we pull it down from flowbat.com, the Silk on a box. In this case, it's we're Ubuntu 14.04 that we're using, and then you just install it. And in the meantime, it's going to ask you a couple questions, like literally like 2 questions, and then it's basically going to do its own thing. So it'll take about 5 minutes to go, and in the meantime, you can kind of do whatever you want. So we also have a CentOS installer as well. So if you have up to 6.5, you can install as well. So if you have epilepsy, close your eyes for like a couple seconds. Seriously. So we're going to install Silk. Time works this fast in Bowling Green, actually. It's amazing. So we go around. I'm going to check the mail. That cat runs out of the door all the time, so it's shut. But go in and play with the cat a little bit, a few minutes. That's Cheeto. Cheeto is a Bengal cat. It's more like a Bengal tiger. She's very ferocious. But enough talk. We're done. So Silk should work now. If you do any kind of play around on the net or whatever on the monitor port or whatever, and you should see some data show up within like 30 seconds because it has to stack data up. We didn't talk about what it means to stack on these records and what records are made of, but they have these timeouts. So like if I'm not seeing data, like I would in TCP dump or something, well, you're not going to because it's going to like build these records as you're browsing. So what does Silk look like? Well, here is just looking at some data for the current day until the current time, start of the day until the current time. And basically you have these records here, and that's kind of like the default look for Silk. That's using RWCut, which converts the binary to a human readable form. And then you also have these 10 protocols that you can do stats on, but you can look at that later. It's ugly by comparison to what I'm going to show you in a minute. You can do PCAP conversions too, but for future purposes, you can just look at this on the slides. So Flowbat itself, again, Chris Sanders and I made that. It's really quick way to get going with flows. You can get it here. We'll skip to the good stuff. Same kind of deal with Silk. You can go get a drink or something. Epilepsy warning. Commencing. So I'm installing Flowbat now. Ask a couple questions. Gonna run around. I'm gonna make a chicken brine. Again, I fry chicken a lot, so this is kind of like a Chick-fil-A copy. But I would say it's better for nuggets than Chick-fil-A's nuggets are. I don't know who likes Chick-fil-A here, but I imagine all hands would go up. Willie's hands, Tara's, that's good. So I'm making this brine. It, again, takes 7 to 9 minutes for Flowbat to install. What we're doing on here is just a clean Ubuntu box that has Silk already installed from that previous video. It's the same box, basically made these back to back. But again, it's not too hard. So I'm mixing up the brine there. Well, we're out of time. It's already installed. I got half the brine done. But it's a 2-hour brine, so it's fine. So Flowbat basics. That's Cheeto again. Now I've now introduced Cheeto, so you will see pictures of Cheeto for no great reason other than entertainment. So Flowbat. Here we're looking at just the same query that we looked at earlier. It's pulling all records for the current day, and it's kind of already done. You see the query is much shorter. You're only putting in these partitioning switches, so it's kind of easy as cake to look through those things. Looking at Chinese IP addresses because they're bad, right? Again, I work for FireEye. So we're looking between local and any kind of Chinese IP addresses using this NECC tag. And basically that comes from a MaxMind deal that we're basing off of MaxMind's country code database. Basically we're going through the query builder this time instead of that quick search, and we're adding in this custom additional parameter, which now already exists. NECC exists as a basic parameter. But what you're going to have is when we execute, there are results. And this was, I think, for a little longer. So you see it kind of takes a little bit more, but I think this was a week search. You see from the 1st of March to the 7th. And so there's some data. We can also sort these things around, shut off things, and just go to the 5 tuple. And then you can drag and drop whatever you need to do. All this is done in Node using the Meteor framework. So it's, if you hate Node or if you're a red team guy, maybe you can find some holes in this whole thing. But Node's pretty awesome as far as making things interactive. Yeah, I won't go too much into stats. I showed them before. We're kind of doing the same thing here, doing a query and building it up, and we're going to do basically looking at everything for the current day, some just different pairs and how many bytes that they're talking in. So it's done. You see how much these guys have talked together, and pretty easy to do. Count will basically give us a graph, which I'm going to skip ahead on this one for sake of time, because it'll show it here. Basically, I saved this graph as a dashboard, and then you can just throw it into the dashboard, as you're choosing, set it to go and execute periodically. So if it's a dashboard that's up on your, in your SOC or something like that, you can see, how, your total traffic, or if you're a NetOps person, that's pretty important. We can also do again, I talked about YAF doing any kind of non-standard ports, looking at, the actual payload data. This is basically saying, hey, look at anything of actual, legitimate communications that are established, and we're going to look for things that aren't necessarily on what they claim to be. So you may have an example, maybe Flowbat runs on 1800. Well, it's HTTP stuff. So this is going to see that, okay, this port 1800 stuff is actually HTTP traffic. And again, YAF does that when it generates the flows. And yeah, there you go. So there were 5 different distinct ports that looked like SSL traffic, and a few for the others. There's better ways of doing this, specifically using the app labeling. Just now I use just that plugin, but on here we use app labeling. So you can also analyze PCAP traffic. Again, I've just thrown in this exploit kit traffic, and it generates flows on the spot right there. As long as the flows, or as long as the PCAP's stored on the Flowbat box. We're almost out of time, so we're going to talk about flow automation very briefly. Kind of just throw this slide up there. You can look at it later. There's tools like Silk Analysis Pipeline that do beaconing detection, stuff like that. There's also Flow Plotter, which is a tool that I wrote. It's basically just something you just throw at the end. You pipe all your Silk data to it, and it'll make cool graphs like these. And so you have in the middle, very middle, there's an asset plotter, which just automatically tries to understand the assets on your network without having to actually dig through the data. The bottom right is a useless force-directed graph that tricks managers and coworkers into thinking you're right. There are, some bubble charts that do 3-axis things that are really hard to ask questions of, but when you get a good answer in, you're like, hey, this bubble chart really worked out. And then your standard other charts there. So in summary, Silk's really fast, really easy to set up, tons of analysis tools. You can kind of do anything you want to with it. A lot of people ask if there's an API for Flowbat, and I always tell them, why don't you just do the Silk queries? But maybe, it would make sense someday to have an API. But again, best documentation in the world. Flowbat, not the best documentation in the world, because there's not all that much to do with it. I mean, we have documentation on flowbat.com and in the actual app itself. But again, it's by analysts and for analysts. I do this all the time. So we try to make it as good as we can make it for us, and then usually people appreciate that. You can get it there. So in conclusion, you should use flow data. Who all is using flow data right now? Hands up. Oh, this is the best audience ever. So it's I don't have to tell you, it's easy to use once you get used to it. It's awesome. So we appreciate it very much, me and Cheeto. I guess probably no time for questions, but I do have a giveaway. I mentioned 3 flow solutions earlier. This may be too hard of a question. That Silk was one of them. What are the other 2? Who said it? Okay. You get an Odroid C2. There you go. It may or may not work. And, well, that's it. I appreciate it very much.